All right, today we are going to do our introduction to dystopian literature. We're going to start talking about some vocabulary words that you'll be responsible for knowing, and then we will get into some of the characteristics of dystopian literature. So, on your guided notes, just make sure that you're filling in the blanks as we go. So, when we're looking at dystopia, one thing that is very prevalent is propaganda. And so, propaganda is information that is spread to promote some cause. So, propaganda can be used for good, it can also be used for bad. It just kind of depends on who, like what kind of government is involved and who is putting out the propaganda and for what purpose. So, for example, you see over here this army poster. This is a recruitment poster that they used to use to try to recruit people into the army. So you have Uncle Sam. He is saying, I want you for the US Army, kind of like pointing sternly, right? So this is a piece of basically advertising, right, that the government put out to encourage people to join the army. Here's another example that's maybe a little bit more extreme. Sometimes propaganda sort of uses hyperbole, right? We've talked about hyperbole a lot, and sort of emotional appeals, right? Trying to like scare someone or make someone feel something to convince them to do something. So this is an example from World War II, and it says, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. And you see there's this man in this car, and there's sort of the outline of Hitler here. And then they're wanting you to join a car sharing club today. So what happened during World War II is that supplies were very limited. And so gasoline and things like that and oil were rationed. So you could only use so much at a time, so that more resources could go towards the war effort. And so to encourage people to carpool, basically, right, they put out this kind of propaganda that said, like, well, if you're riding alone, then you're supporting Hitler, basically, right, because you're not supporting what the United States is doing. You're not supporting the rationing of gas and the conserving of resources to help the war effort, right? So obviously, right, there were people who didn't carpool, who didn't support Hitler, but this propaganda uses this image because they know that that would create fear and, hopefully encourage patriotism in the people who saw it. So these are some historical examples of propaganda, and we still see propaganda being used today by various countries and various different organizations. Next, we have a utopia. So we're going to be talking about dystopia. So it helps to know what utopia is first, because dystopia is kind of the opposite. So a utopia is an ideally perfect state. Everything is perfect. Everyone seems to live in harmony. Everything seems to be great, right? It's this perfect state. There's nothing bad is happening. Everything is perfect. Dystopia then is the opposite of that, basically the not good place, like we saw in the video. So again, dystopia is a state in which the conditions of life are extremely bad. And we will see there's lots of different types of dystopia. There's lots of different ways that a dystopia could come to be. So like this picture you see sort of looks like maybe like apocalyptic, right? Like something you would maybe see in like a zombie movie or something like that. But those are all examples of dystopia when you think about like the Hunger Games or like I Am Legend, Divergent, any of those kind of movies where you have the conditions of life being just extremely, extremely bad. That is a dystopia. Apocalyptic, like I just mentioned, is of or relating to a catastrophe. So when we talk about the apocalypse, right, sometimes we talk about like the zombie apocalypse or something like that, right? It's like a catastrophe that happens. And then life, is very difficult after that. So of or relating to a catastrophe is apocalyptic. Okay, so to dehumanize is to deprive of the positive qualities of a person. So, a lot of times in a dystopia, one of the things that they will do is treat one group as sort of the other, treat them as less than human, right? Treat them as just a number. And we see this quite frequently. There's what they call the 8 stages of genocide, and dehumanization is one of those stages, just sort of the treating of people as just numbers versus actual people, because then that makes it easier to sort of do terrible things to them, which is something that we tend to see in real world dystopias, as well as in the dystopias that we will read about. Okay, conformity is correspondence in form, type, or appearance. So conformity basically just means everybody is the same. Okay, there's no differences. Everyone does the same thing, acts the same way, wears the same thing, behaves in the exact same ways. Conformity. Next, we have desensitize. So, to desensitize means to cause to be less responsive to or affected by something. So, a lot of times you will hear, parenting experts or things like that that will be concerned that young people are becoming desensitized to violence, right? Because, of violent video games and, the violence that they see on the news and, different catastrophes that have happened and uh, instances of violence that we're becoming desensitized, which basically just means that like we're numb to it, right? We don't even notice it anymore because we've seen it so often. And so a lot of times in dystopian fiction and in real dystopias, people become desensitized. And so then they don't think that it's, as bad when these atrocities happen because they're just numb to it, basically. Okay, a bureaucracy is a government administered primarily by non-elected officials. So basically, if the person in charge, let's say, is like a king or something, and they're just going to put all of their friends into power, that's a bureaucracy, right? It's not an election. It's not, a democracy where people get to vote and stuff like that. It's just people, whoever's in charge is just like picking who they want to take control of the government. Oppression is the act of subjugating by cruelty. So you see the picture there of the boot crushing the smaller person. So kind of just taking control through cruelty. Totalitarian is a government with an authority exerting absolute control. So we talk about different types of governments in, your social studies classes, right? You've got like a republic, you have a democracy, you have a monarchy, right? You have these different types of governments. A totalitarian government is one where they have a complete control over everything. So you'd look at a country like North Korea, where the government of North Korea and the leader of North Korea controls everything that their citizens do. They're not allowed to do anything that the government doesn't approve. Next, we have an ideology. So, an ideology is an orientation that characterizes the thinking of a group. So, it's basically just like a set of beliefs that a group tends to have. So, for example, there is like a Christian ideology, right? Like, if you're a Christian, then there's certain things that you probably believe. If you are a Muslim, you have like a Muslim ideology, right? There's certain things that you probably believe. Sorry, that's the bell. Same thing with political parties, right? If you are a Democrat, then there are certain things that you probably believe, a certain set of beliefs that you probably have. If you're a Republican, there's probably a set of beliefs that you have that you believe in. Now, that doesn't mean that every person necessarily believes every single piece of an ideology, but it's just sort of those broad generalizations that tend to be what the people in that group think. Okay, so that's the end of our vocabulary. So again, make sure that you have those definitions down. We will continue to work with those words throughout the next couple of weeks. We're going to shift over into the characteristics of dystopian literature. This is on the second page of your notes. So in dystopian literature, these are some characteristics that tend to show up. Now, these will not show up in every piece of dystopian literature, Some will have more than others, but all pieces of dystopian literature will have some of these characteristics. So first, propaganda is used to control the citizens of society. And again, we talked about propaganda. That's that advertising that is sort of using fear and emotions to make people believe certain things. Information, independent thought, and freedoms are restricted. We talked about conformity, right? People are expected to conform. A figurehead or a concept is worshipped by the citizens of the society. Citizens are perceived to be under constant surveillance. And feel free to pause the video if you need to copy these down. Citizens have a fear of the outside world, so they are comfortable with what is in their kind of like in their bubble, right? And whatever is outside of that, they're afraid of. Even if their world is terrible, right? They're afraid of what else could be outside. So if you think about like if you've read the Hunger Games or you've seen the Hunger Games, you know that like the people in the districts in the beginning in the first book, yes, they live in terrible conditions, but they're also afraid to go outside of what they know. Citizens live in a dehumanized state. So again, citizens are sort of just treated like a number. You would see that again in the Hunger Games, right? The fact that they're like picking children to go fight in these, deadly games. The natural world is banished and distrusted. So typically people who are in nature are seen as like outsiders and are weird, right? Nature is really just like distrusted. Citizens conform to uniform expectations. Individuality and dissent are bad. So again, that idea of conformity, everyone acts the same, everyone behaves the same, and so on. And the society is an illusion of a perfect utopian world. So when we look at dystopian fiction, typically for the person or people who are in power, it seems like a utopia, right? Because they have everything that they want, but it's at the cost of dehumanizing people, making people conform, getting rid of individuality, and so on. So there's like this illusion of a utopia, but then in reality, it's a dystopia. And you see that again, like I keep using the Hunger Games because I know that's something that a lot of people have read and have seen. But that's a perfect example, right? President Snow and the people who live in the Capitol, they think that they're living this wonderful, glamorous life. They think that they're in a utopian world. But then for the people in the districts, it is very, very clearly a dystopia. Okay, so there's some different types of control in dystopian fiction. Most dystopian works present a world in which oppressive societal control and the illusion of the perfect society are maintained through one of these types of controls. And we'll talk about each one. So the first one is corporate control. So this would be where one or more large corporations control society through products, advertising, or the media. I know it's kind of silly, but if you think about the Disney movie WALL-E, where there's that company by and large and they control everything, that would be an example of corporate control. Bureaucratic control is where society is controlled by a mindless bureaucracy through a tangle of red tape, relentless regulations, and incompetent government officials. So bureaucratic control can also kind of be thought of as governmental control. Then we have technological control. So computers controlled by technology through computers, robots, scientific means. You see this a lot in sort of like futuristic science fiction. I'm thinking of like Minority Report and like iRobot, right? Those would be examples where the computers and robots have kind of like taken over. And then you have philosophical and religious control, where society is controlled by a philosophical or religious ideology. This is often enforced through a dictatorship or a theocratic government. That's where the religion is sort of in charge of the government as well. And so you might see this in some like very extremist religions. If you think about like, I don't know, different religious extremists, they could fall under this type of control. Okay, so the dystopian protagonist. So if you remember, a protagonist is our main character. And the dystopian protagonist, again, doesn't necessarily always fit all of these, but is going to fit some of them. They often feel trapped and they are struggling to escape. They question the existing social and political systems. They believe or feel that something is terribly wrong with the society in which he or she lives. And they help us as the audience to recognize the negative aspects of the dystopian world through their perspective. So again, I'm going to go back to the Hunger Games, right? Katniss feels trapped. She's struggling to escape. She's questioning, right, the system of the Hunger Games. She thinks that there's something wrong with that society. And you see that even again when she, goes to the other district at the in the later books. And she helps us see the negative aspects of the dystopian world. Imagine if the Hunger Games were told from President Snow's perspective, right, where he thinks everything is great, and then these terrible rebels come and break everything down, right? So it's we see the world through their eyes, and that helps us to understand the negative aspects of the world that they live in. Okay, and I think that is it. Yes. So if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Make sure that you keep these notes handy, put them in your English 1 folder so that you have them. You will have some questions on upcoming quizzes about how well certain characters and certain situations match with these characteristics that we've talked about.